The oldest tools that have been identified as being made by humans for the purpose of making sound are a number of flute fragments excavated in Germany from sites such as Geisenklosterli and Hohlefels. The most recent carbon datings place the most ancient specimens at around 43,000 years old. The flutes are constructed from hollow bird bones, usually the wing bones of large flying birds, such as vultures, in which finger holes have been scraped out, not bored or pierced through as you might imagine. This may seem like a small thing, but it is significant, because scraping the holes into the surface of the bone rather than piercing them through produces the kind of scalloping around the finger holes which we still see today in modern recorders. The way the holes on a recorder are scalloped around the edges, creating a sort of bowl shape, helping the fingers to find their placement and to control the inflections of the note. The techniques like this and others by which these flutes were made are sufficiently advanced that we cannot think that these were the first tools of this kind. There were likely older examples that are either lost or waiting to be discovered. The very design of the flute, with multiple holes, almost certainly had a number of precursors, as it embodies a high degree of conceptual complexity. So it's unlikely that it just appeared in this form out of nowhere. The form of the hollow pipe with holes along its length is, in a sense, an abstraction. It is a way of embodying in a single pipe many pipes of different lengths, so that instead of having to use a pipe of a different length each time you need a different tone, the flute allows the player to simulate pipes of different lengths simply by opening and closing the finger holes, and so changing the path taken by the air which is blown into the instrument. This design would in time prove to be one of the most successful and enduring of all tonal instruments, as seen in the endless variations on this design found across the world today, and also in other prehistoric designs of this kind dating back to the Upper Palaeolithic and the Neolithic, found all the way from the western tip of Europe to China and across tens of thousands of years. As we mentioned in episode 4, it's likely that the earliest means by which our ancestors would have enhanced the sounds produced by the mouth would have been by placing their hands around the mouth while calling, to amplify and to direct the sound just as we do today. Naturally, though, behaviours of this kind leave no traces in the archaeological record. At some later time, it is likely that vocal resonators would have come into use. Hollow objects, either shaped by nature or human hands, that, when spoken or sung into, would alter or amplify the voice in all kinds of interesting ways. It is easy to imagine that in certain contexts, these objects would have held deep significance. Even today, we see in many traditional ritual practices the use of masks to represent spirits and other unseen beings. And these masks often include resonators of some kind that either distort or amplify or otherwise mask the voice. Again, though, even if we could find traces of an object that essentially had the right kind of shape, it would be virtually impossible to determine whether that was in fact its use. At some point, though, our ancestors would have discovered the interesting sounds produced by blowing into a pipe. Whether this was by experimenting with vocal resonators or in the course of more quote-unquote practical activities, such as blowing through a hollow reed to revive a fire. Or maybe they just stumbled upon this completely by chance while doing nothing in particular. Just like a school kid finding out that a ruler makes a funny noise when you twang it over the edge of a desk. And this last option does seem very plausible. After all, we do have a seemingly innate tendency to poke at things and play around with them for no reason. And this probably goes a long way to explaining a good chunk of our technological development. Now, even using basic hollow pipes with no holes, they would have had a few ways of modulating the pitch of the pipe, using techniques such as bending or overblowing, or by holding multiple pipes, say one in each hand, allowing them to switch between tones. And even once the idea of adding finger holes to the pipe was hit upon, its first use might not have been to create melodies, as we might think. Perhaps the earliest examples included just a single hole, allowing the player to quickly interpolate between two tones. The reality, though, with all these hypothetical intermediary stages, is that even if we did or have found fragments preserved, it would be almost impossible to correctly identify what their function was. So the reason the flutes in Geisenklosterli and Hohlefels are the oldest musicking tools that we have is that the very specific design of the flute makes it easy to identify them as such. But it is likely that tools for musicking were being made much earlier than 43,000 years ago. And as we have seen previously, it is likely that proto-musicking behaviours date back even hundreds of thousands of years. Now, while it's true that flutes may be slightly easier to identify as musicking tools than other fragments we have, correctly identifying them can still be very tricky. One of the most notorious cases is the supposed bone flute of the Dauvois caves in Slovenia. This fragment, also from around 43,000 years ago, received quite a bit of attention in the press, and it was dubbed the Neanderthal flute. And you can still find articles today where it is described as the oldest prehistoric flute. More recently, though, after years of incredibly detailed analysis, the general consensus is that the holes on this bone fragment are most likely the result of a cave bear gnawing or biting on the bone. On the other hand, in the case of the flutes at Geisenklosterli and Hohlefels, some of the telltale signs that help to confirm that they were in fact worked by humans are the scalloping around the finger holes we mentioned earlier. In the Slovenian example, the holes are punched through the bone, as might result from a bite. There are markings which are also found near the finger holes in the German models, which were likely used to work out the placement of the holes. Again, these are absent from the Slovenian example. And in some instances, there are also additional, rather enigmatic markings, which reconstructions have confirmed were notched into the bone after the finger holes were cut. these notches have been very difficult to interpret. Having been incised after the finger holes were cut, they could not have been used to help figure out the placement of the holes. And they don't seem to be decorative because they're a bit haphazard. One potential clue is that they seem to bunch up as they reach the end, suggesting that perhaps the people who made them did not know how many notches they were going to make when they started out. When we consider the likely use for some of these instruments, some scholars have suggested that what we may be looking at here is the document of a prehistoric tradition. Perhaps the flute was only used at a certain place, or a certain time, or for certain rituals, and each time it was used, another notch would be cut. Over the course of years, maybe even generations, as the notches built up, they would have started to incise them closer and closer, in order to be able to continue fitting more in. But as you can imagine, this is a very contested point. Now, what further cements these earliest flutes found in Germany as being man-made is also the context in which they are found. Many other examples of flutes have also been excavated in these caves, dating over a period of several thousand years, implying that this was an ongoing activity at the site, maybe even a single continuing tradition enduring for thousands of years. And some of the later examples found here are so sophisticated that there can be no doubt that they were made by human hands. One of the most striking examples is found at Hohle Fels, dating back around 40,000 years. On the surface, the design is fairly similar to the bird bone flutes we have seen so far, but with one crucial difference. It was made out of ivory, which would have made the operational sequence to produce the flute much more complex. Ivory is harder to work than bird bones, and bird bones have the advantage of already being naturally hollow, making them the perfect starting point for making a flute. The mammoth tusk would have to be hollowed out. It would have first been cut down to roughly the right length. Then it would have been split in half lengthways all the way down so that the core of the tusk could be scraped out, leaving two hollowed out halves. All of this would have to be done by hand, using only stone tools, meaning weeks of highly skilled and very physically demanding work. Researchers who have recreated the Paleolithic techniques that would have been used to sculpt ivory describe the work not only as technically very difficult, they also report experiencing significant pain in their hands and joints as a result of the work. Once the two halves of the tusk were hollowed out, they were then glued back together with adhesive made from materials collected from the surrounding landscape that would be heated over a fire in a small pot of some kind. Notches were also cut along the length of the split, possibly to aid in the binding process of the adhesive. All of this, and then you would still have to do all the normal work that would have gone into making a flute, scraping out the finger holes, cutting the embouchure, and so on. This ivory flute was the work of a highly skilled specialist. And what would all this work have achieved? Essentially, a flute almost identical to the bird bone flutes, but with two important distinctions. It would have been slightly larger, and therefore also had a deeper and richer sound. And the ivory would have given it a smooth, pearly white, almost iridescent surface. This might not seem like very much to us, but think of what we saw when talking about music in hunter-gatherer societies, how certain instruments have talismanic significance, instruments able to channel the voices of ancestors and other unseen beings, instruments that manipulate invisible forces and enchant landscapes, places, animals, and people, and how they are central to many ritual and storytelling activities that define the very identity of the group, and some are even held to embody the deeper mysteries of the cosmos. So when we see the amount of work that went into making this flute, we can only surmise that this object would have held incredibly deep significance for the people who once played it. We also see other developments in flute-making technology during the Paleolithic. The oldest known instance of a block and duct flute, for example, was found in Belgium. The block and duct design includes the use of a sound window just after the mouthpiece that directs the breath towards a block placed inside the pipe that results in a more powerful vibrating air column. This 25,000-year-old design is still used in recorders today. And while the block is missing from this oldest specimen, we have a similar later example where, against all odds, a resin plug functioning as the block was found still preserved within the pipe. And the thing that makes it even more remarkable that we have examples of flutes that have survived up to the modern day at all is that the majority of flutes would likely have been made of perishable materials like wood and reeds. As we saw in episode 5 when looking at the traditional instruments of more recent hunter-gatherers, most are made from extremely perishable materials. And even though, as we have said previously, we should not be taking contemporary hunter-gatherers simply as a model for Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, on the other hand, it is true that they share many of the same affordances in terms of technology and resources. So the majority of instruments used by our ancestors simply had no chance of surviving to the modern day. In fact, it is likely that many of the most common sound producers are precisely the ones that we have no trace of. Instruments that were made simply and out of perishable materials were the easiest to make and would have been the most common. Complex instruments like flutes made out of bone or ivory were likely very rare, but they are the ones that have survived to this day. You see, when we think of musical instruments, our mind usually goes straight to tonal instruments, in particular ones on which you can play a melody, like a piano or a recorder or a violin. But the reality is that in the broader scope of the last 50 to 100,000 years of human musicking, melodic lines have usually been carried by the human voice and not by an instrument. The most common form of music making found among hunter-gatherers is vocalizing, the human voice, often accompanied by percussion. Voice and percussion, or some variation of this combination, constitutes the overwhelming majority of musicking ensembles. And interestingly, when tonal instruments are used, they're often not used so much to carry melodies as such, but to create drones. Think of a didgeridoo or a bull roarer. And historically, this has been a very popular way of using tonal instruments the world over, even in the West really, almost up until the early Renaissance. But then, over the course of the Baroque, the Classical and the Romantic periods, as the figure of the composer gained prominence, the use of drones all but disappeared. Which is why, to Western ears, musics with drones can still seem quite strange and exotic today. An association that film composers are happy to use, and sometimes abuse. Now, it does make sense that voice and percussion would be the predominant sounds of human musicking. After all, that's likely where it all started. If we could journey back in time, before musicking ever left any traces in the archaeological record, it is likely that the earliest gestures that we might recognize as proto-musical behaviours in early humans would be some form of song-like vocalizations or rhythmic beating of hands and feet. Many musical instruments developed as extensions of these two gestures. Things like beaters, sticks, and other kinds of percussive instruments are often very obvious extensions of the beating gestures, and those prehistoric flutes were in a sense extensions of the mouth, of breath, and of vocalization. All this seems fairly obvious. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting. It may be that string instruments also originated as extensions of the sound-producing abilities of the mouth, just like wind instruments. This might seem strange to us, as we're not accustomed to see a string instrument placed in the mouth in a position similar to that of a wind instrument. But this may in fact be precisely how some of the earliest string instruments were played. The first string instruments were likely in the form of a simple bow. We know from archaeological remains that the earliest harps, for example, were variations on the classic bow design. In origin, these musical bows were likely indistinguishable in appearance from the bows used for archery, and may even have been the exact same bows. We have a number of similar musical instruments still existing today, centering most commonly around Africa, which are loosely grouped under the term mouth bow, precisely because they are played by placing one end of the bow in the mouth or with the mouth in proximity of the bow string. The string is then plucked or more often beaten rhythmically with a thin stick, almost the same size as an arrow shaft, in fact. As many of these instruments are beaten rather than plucked, then it might be better to say that these early string instruments were a combination of the vocalizing gesture and the beating gesture. The way these are played produces a sort of rhythmic drone, and the mouth is used as a resonating chamber. Changing the shape of the mouth varies the tonal contours of the drone. Now, it's hard to say how long the technology of the bow has been around for, as bows, again, are made of perishable materials. But from the archaeological evidence of potential arrowheads, some speculate even as far back as 100,000 years ago or more. The oldest bow we have is about 18,000 years old. Either way, it would be almost impossible to determine from the remains of bows whether any were used for musicking. Bows have many possible uses, and even today The San people of the Kalahari are known to convert hunting bows to musical bows, so one use does not exclude the other. We do, however, have a very mysterious image engraved on the walls of the Trois Frères cave dating back 13,000 years, which appears to show a man wearing a full bison hide, including the head, almost like some form of camouflage, standing in the middle of a moving, sprawling mass of herd animals, holding up to his face what appears to be a bow. Now, if you think back to what we said about the way in which Blackfoot hunters used musicking during the hunt, then you can understand why this figure is interpreted as potentially being a magician hunter of some sort with a musical bow. And the idea that something like the mouth bow would have been one of the earliest forms of string instrument makes a lot of sense. Even many contemporary string instruments are in a sense a development of this bow and mouth combination. Imagine beating a basic bow without placing it in the mouth. It would make a bit of sound, but not much. By placing it in the mouth, this turns the oral cavity and the whole head, in fact, into a resonator. The next step, then, in the evolution of string instruments would be to attach a resonating body of some sort to the bow, just as a modern guitar or zither or violin also has a hollow body with the hole somewhere in proximity of the strings, performing the same function as the opening of the mouth did. We find the earliest examples of string instruments with resonators during antiquity, but there were likely older instances. We even still see today examples of what the earliest bow and resonator designs would likely have looked like. Just something like a simple gourd attached to the wooden staff of the bow. The example of this design that Westerners are most familiar with is likely the berimbau, used in capoeira. Now, interestingly, these very simple and likely earliest bow and resonator designs tend to have the hole placed on the back of the gourd, facing away from the string. And this may seem strange at first until you see that in a number of traditions, players will hold the bow so that this hole on the resonator is pressed against the flat of the belly, meaning that by moving the bow while playing, they can open and close the hole, creating the same undulating variations in timbre that were originally created by opening and closing the mouth, as we can hear in this amazing example from Zambia of a one-stringed bow and resonator instrument known as the kalumbu. As with all the other incredible examples of musicking in this video, you can find links to that in the description. Now, once string instruments were given their own mouths and bodies, the link with the human vocal cavity could be severed, and string instruments would come to be played in a manner that we are more familiar with today. Returning now for a moment to instruments for which we have more direct evidence, phalangeal whistles, so called because they consist of the phalanx of a reindeer or some other ungulate. The phalanxes are the 3 small bones that make up each of your fingers, but in hoofed animals they're obviously a lot bigger. In the archaeological record, we find a number of these large phalangeal bones with a single hole punctured through, and when you blow into them, they produce quite a piercing tone. However, phalangeal whistles can be difficult to identify as the bones naturally puncture in almost exactly the same way as man-made whistles when placed under pressure. However, just as with the flutes, we have some whistles that have been incised or that have other signs that confirm that they were in fact worked by humans. Now, something very strange about these whistles was stumbled upon by Michel Dauvois in the late 90s. He's a paleontologist with an experimental streak. On the Russian-Finnish border, he carried out a series of experiments in the presence of reindeer herds, essentially using these whistles in the context within which presumably they would have been used in prehistory, perhaps to signal at a distance while hunting. Dauvois reports that on multiple occasions and with multiple different herds, when the whistles were played, quote, herds of reindeer, at first intrigued by the whistling, came near the sound source, but after repeating the whistling, they laid down on the snow or ice. End quote. Now, if these whistles had the power to attract the reindeer and induce them to lie down, as well as being a potential means of communicating over distances, then it is likely that to the magician hunters, the reindeer charmers who wielded them, they would have been objects of great power. And the sympathetic connection that it was the very bone of the reindeer that, when played, enchanted the reindeer itself would not have gone unnoticed. Continuing this theme of very mysterious musical instruments, we come now to what for many people is probably one of the stranger musical instruments / sound producers, the bull roarer, or as it is described in Geneviève Calame-Griaule's seminal work on the Dogon people of West Africa, the voice that eats everything. You may remember from the last episode how we discussed the way in which it is often used to channel the voices of spirits and other invisible beings, such as in the Yoruba funerary ritual performed on the third day of funeral rites, known as the opening of the voice of the deceased, in which the voice of the new ancestor is heard for the first time. And I think it's easy to hear how it would have come to acquire this association as a talking instrument. In fact, even among talking instruments, the bull roarer often seems to have a very special status. In essence, the bull roarer is a flat piece of almost any material, honestly. Wood, bone, stone, antler. These days, it could even be made out of plastic. Usually these flat objects are anywhere up to about 30 centimeters or so in length, with a shape like an elongated oval, almost like a tiny surfboard, I guess. At one end, it has a small hole through which a string is threaded. It is played by holding the end of the string in one hand and by spinning it in the air above the head, a bit like a lasso. The sound produced by this is a tonal, droning buzz which scatters in all directions and can vary from a low, rumbling growl like thunder all the way up to a high-pitched scream, depending on the size of the bull roarer and the speed at which it is spun. Dauvois has taken bull roarers down into cave chambers and spun them, and with the reverberation of the caves, he describes it as truly a flying sound. Again, many bull roarers would likely have been made of materials that will not have survived up to the present, so we don't have much in the way of remains. We do have some examples of bone from the Paleolithic that has been worked into a shape that looks a lot like it could be a bull roarer, but these finds could also be fishing weights or perhaps very large pendants. However, we do have a few likely candidates, the most famous being the La Roche Paleophone, as it's called, dated to sometime around 18,000 years ago. Now this one is decorated with red ochre, meaning that it likely would not have been used as a fishing weight, as ochre is not water resistant, and its large size, about 18 centimetres in length, makes it a prime candidate for a bull roarer. As pointed out by Iain Morley in the Prehistory of Music, he makes the point that analysing the kind of use wear that forms on modern bull roarers around the hole due to the friction of the string, and then searching for similar wear patterns on these ancient finds could help to confirm whether they likely would have been used as bull roarers or not. However, despite being unable to directly confirm the use of bull roarers in the Paleolithic through evidence from the archaeological record, the fact that the bull roarer would have been used by our ancient ancestors seems almost beyond dispute when looking at the ubiquity of the bull roarer both historically and across the world today. We find bull roarers being used across all inhabited continents. In some cases, their use would seem to be more obviously practical, such as in Malaysia, where they're used to scare animals away from plantations. Although, who knows, even here there may be symbolic aspects going on as well. I myself don't know enough about the bull roarer practices in Malaysia to rule that out. But in almost all other cases, in fact, its ritual, religious, or symbolic significance runs very deep. And the fact that this instrument is so ubiquitous across the world means that its use during the Paleolithic is pretty much universally accepted as likely going back several tens of thousands of years into the past at least. Not just because many of these instances likely share a common ancient origin, but also because otherwise our alternative is to imagine that all these cultures around the world suddenly independently invented the bull roarer only in relatively recent times, when no humans in the previous 50,000 years had done so, despite essentially having the same physical, cultural, and technological affordances as a number of these more recent peoples. Now, moving into the world of percussion instruments, things get even more speculative. As we said, the majority of instruments that we see among hunter-gatherers are some variety of percussion, and it makes sense that this would also be the case in the Paleolithic. But looking for evidence of percussive musicking in the historical record is often impossible. A lot of percussive musicking across the world is performed just by clapping, or by stomping feet or drumming on the body, or even, as you heard in some of the examples we played in the last episode of Aka or Ba'aka musicking, by drumming on water. The practice of liquindi, where the performers stand in the water and hit the water's surface with the palm of the hand to create a very distinctive percussive clap as each impact traps air between the hand and the surface of the water. None of these musicking activities leave any lasting traces. They are as ephemeral as the sounds that they produce. And even in instances where we do find evidence of repeated beating on a surface, it is very hard to say that this was definitely the result of musicking. As with singing, it is likely that the origins of percussive behaviours stretch much further back into the past than we will ever be able to directly trace. Now, one of the percussion instruments that we could potentially identify is the rasp. This is basically a serrated or notched surface that produces a sound when a rod or something similar is dragged across its surface. And we do find a number of objects and surfaces with evenly spaced grooves notched into them. In fact, this seems to have been quite a recurring concern of ancient Gravettian humans, active around 33,000 to about 20,000 years ago. For whatever reason, creating these notched designs was something that they were particularly into. And again, and I feel that I'm saying this a lot, but it's hard to say which of these, if any, would have been used for musicking. The patterns could be for decoration, or to improve grip, or even as some form of memory storage. Some sort of tally, or as a way of recording a recurring event. However, there are a few remains that do fit quite nicely with the hypothesis that they may be rasps. These tend to be long bones with notches that aren't just simple lines that you might use for record keeping. They are deeply scalloped grooves, and some of these fragments even feature a loop at one end that could have been used as some sort of handle, allowing players to hold them without dampening the vibrations. Some are even found in association with other, more clear examples of musical instruments, reinforcing this case. Investigating the patterns of use where that are characteristic of current musical rasps could potentially help in better interpreting these finds. We also have another potential case of an elusive image in a cave in Dordogne. This is a rock carving of what appears to be a woman holding a horn in her hand with clear notches incised on it. Some have interpreted this as a depiction of a woman holding a rasp, although there may be other explanations, with some, for example, pointing out how the horn-like object has 13 notches, corresponding to the number of lunar cycles in the year, which could be just as plausible an explanation for this image as the rasp hypothesis. After all, these humans would have been very attentive observers of the world around them. And as some have pointed out, the horn does also have something of a crescent moon shape to it. Other finds that have been interpreted as potential percussion instruments are a very enigmatic set of small stone flakes dating back to about 20,000 years ago that have been quite deliberately worked, but to what end it is very hard to say. Due to the sonic properties of these flakes, some have suggested they may be the remains of prehistoric wind chimes. Another equally complex find is a set of 6 mammoth bones from Russia, dating back again some 20,000 years. These show clear signs of wear from percussion in specific points which produce tones when they're struck. Again, we cannot say for certain that this is indicative of musicking behaviour, but the fact that these bones were found in association with what appear to be beaters and ivory rattles, as well as the fact that they were located in what seems to be a centrally placed, non-residential hut, maybe a place of ceremonial activity, does bolster the musicking hypothesis. In a number of sites across the world, we find examples of what are referred to as rock gongs or singing stones. These are large boulders that have very distinctive signs of percussive wear, showing that these rocks were repeatedly struck in very specific points. Points that produce distinct, resonant, metallic-sounding tones. And the correlation between the points that show signs of wear and the points that produce these resonant tones is so consistent that it is hard to imagine that it was anything other than the interesting acoustic properties of these stones that were the cause of these behaviours. On top of this, we also have examples of more recent rock gongs from the Bronze Age, which were used for thousands of years, and in some very rare instances, they have continued to be played up to the present day. One of the most striking examples of a potential lithophone, that's the technical term for musical instruments that use stone to generate sound, from the Greek word lithos, meaning stone, is a very large formation of stalactites and stalagmites in the caves of Nerja in Spain. This formation is known as the organ, because its rippling columns appear almost like the pipes of a pipe organ. The structure is around 4 meters in height, with a width of about 5 meters or so, and the descending columns form over 200 calcite folds, which are richly decorated in abstract designs and depictions of animals, estimated to have been painted some 20,000 years ago, based on calcite deposition. Many of the columns and the folds show clear evidence of deliberate chipping along the edge, and it seems that these were produced around a similar time as the artwork. When struck, these structures produce very clear tones, almost like a harp or celesta. And in fact, in general, stalactite formations produce a variety of tonal sounds when struck, from more evidently percussive tones, such as these, to tones so clear they almost sound synthesized. This second recording is from a cave in Virginia that has been kitted out with an expensive set of mechanisms that strike different areas of stalactite formations across the cave which are all controlled by an organ-like keyboard. This instrument is affectionately known as the stalagpipe organ. The conjecture in the case of the stalactite formation in the caves of Nerja is that these sections were intentionally chipped off in order to tune the rock formation by changing the length of the different sections. Now, the formation at Nerja is not the only case of this kind that we see. A similar formation has been found in the caves of Rucador in France, again decorated with abstract designs and with a number of fragments broken off on many of the ridges. In this instance, the significance of this practice is heightened by the fact that the fragments that were broken off were restituted. They were, in a sense, given back to the rock formation by wedging them between the ridges of the formation, where they have since been cemented back in place by calcification, suggesting behaviours that we would now associate with sympathetic magic practices. And the formation at Rucador also produces very clear, resonant tones when struck. Just as with the singing rocks, the evidence that ancient humans were aware of the curious acoustic properties of these formations is very compelling. We can see from the numerous images that adorn them, as well as the signs of wear, that these stalactite formations were of great interest to our ancestors. They seem to have been a focal point of activity, maybe like an altar of sorts, but likely with a more totemic value. And it is only natural that these should have been of such great interest to prehistoric humans. When we visit caves today, we too are mesmerized by the sight of these descending curtain-like sheets of calcite and by imposing stalactite columns. And they would have been equally mesmerizing to them. After all, their brains and their cognitive capacities were the same as ours. In fact, it's likely that through their eyes, rippling in the dancing light of the fire, they would have appeared even more wondrous than they do to us. We should not discount the idea that to them, such a formation would have been a living being of some sort. We talked in the last episode about what it means to live in a world in which everything is inhabited by spirits, where the very landscape is alive. And the evidence that we see for restitution behaviours in the formation at Rucador is consistent with this. And if structures like the organ at Nerja and Rucador were, as they clearly seem to have been, the focal point of a rich variety of behaviours, with humans adorning them, shaping them, chipping them, interacting with them in a variety of ways, then it is much easier to imagine that these ancient humans would have also noticed the interesting acoustic properties of these structures and harnessed these powers, rather than to imagine that they spent all this time interacting with these rock formations, but never noticed the interesting sounds they make. These were, after all, people who lived in much closer contact with the world around them than we do, and whose senses would have been much sharper than ours. If we have noticed them, they surely would have too. And if you think of it from the perspective of someone who sees that everything in the world around them is alive, then consider how powerful it would be to find in the dark depths of caves huge, iridescent, rock formations that already stand out from the other rocks by their appearance alone. And then when you go up and touch them, you find that they are singing, talking rocks. It is likely beyond us to truly imagine how significant they could have been to those humans. The pictorial art found in Paleolithic caves also provides further evidence that these ancient humans were very interested in the acoustics of the world they inhabited. In fact, we should consider that the resonant, reverberant acoustic qualities of caves may have been one of the various factors that attracted our ancestors to them, as much as the more obvious advantages like shelter. Even today, the caves at Nerja are used as concert spaces due to the resonant qualities of the chambers. And the Paleolithic art found in some caves points to the fact that exploring the acoustics of the caves was a fundamental activity even then. One of the pivotal studies in introducing this idea was a survey conducted in the late 1980s by Iegor Reznikoff and our experimental paleontologist friend Michel Dauvois, documenting the placement of the rock art in 3 different Paleolithic cave systems in the Pyrenees. As they made their way through the caves, they made vocalizations and used whistles, all things that would have been available to ancient Paleolithic humans. And they used the vocalizations and the whistles to locate points of resonance, locations, in other words, that resonated with specific tones. And they found that the placement of the rock art clustered around these points of resonance. Most of the cave paintings across the cave systems were found either on or within a meter of a point of resonance. The consistency of this overlap across the various chambers led them to conclude that the placement of the paintings was informed by the resonant properties of the cave. And in fact, it seems that this acoustic aspect took precedence even over the visual for deciding the position of the rock art, because the peculiar locations of these paintings mean that sometimes you have to go right up to them before they come into view. Other times you have to crane your neck round into alcoves or assume other strange positions to see them properly. They do not seem to have been particularly concerned with making these images immediately visible. And this is also found in the artwork on the formations in Nerja and Rucador, where a significant number of images is found between the folds of the calcite columns, and they only become fully visible close up. It is also worth noting that many of the images on these resonant surfaces are not figurative. Sometimes they're just a handful of dots. Perhaps the abstract images carried some symbolic significance. Maybe they simply served to mark these places of resonance. Maybe a bit of both. Now, to us, it could seem strange that the visual should almost appear to take second place to the auditory in this way, as we live in a world that is dominated by visual communication. But as we saw in the last episode, this seems to be, at least in part, a result of our particular social and technological context. We live in very brightly lit environments pretty much all the time, but for ancient humans, much of their world would not have been immediately visible. We saw the case of the Aka and the Mbuti pygmies living in the rainforests of Central Africa, who display a very deep connection with sound. And this makes sense. In the darkness of the forest, much of their world cannot be seen, especially at night, but it can always be heard. And so, being aware of the sounds of the world becomes of the utmost importance. And caves, even more than forests, are places of deep, enveloping darkness. And lighting fires only does so much to change this. Curiously, Reznikoff and Dauvois found during their surveys that vocalizing and listening to its reverberation was surprisingly useful for navigating the caves. And there are other accounts of vocalization or singing being used as an aid for exploring caves. So maybe exploring the resonance had a practical value to our ancestors as much as a symbolic one. Or a better way of saying it would be that imagining that there is a clear distinction between practical and ritualized behaviours is probably not a very good way to think about human behaviours. We can instead look at the biocultural evolution of ritualized behaviours as the seed for the emergence of the kind of human modernity that paleoanthropologists talk about. In other words, ritual as the very underpinning of that whole set of interwoven behaviours and artefacts that we refer to when we use the phrase human culture. Think back for a second to the site at Boxgrove in southern England, where we see the remains of a flurry of activity that took place 500,000 years ago as a small band of ancient humans butchered a carcass that they had either stumbled upon or hunted. As we said in episode 4, this site is so important because we find traces of all aspects of this process. The gathering and the preparing of stones, the skilled butchering of the carcass, and so on. And we see in this process what seems to be a basic form of routine and division of labour that facilitated such a complex task. From all the evidence we have, these human beings didn't have anything like our modern languages. But we can see that there are patterns in the behaviours that cannot be simply explained as a result of co-present, moment-to-moment interactions. They are, in a sense, developing a tradition. The sense that this is the way that we do this thing. And the way in which you do a thing within a tradition is determined by invisible patterns that do not so much exist out there in the world, but in the shared imagination of the group. Having a way, a routine in which you do a given thing facilitates the very doing of it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. We even notice this when sometimes our routines are thrown off or we can't do things in a way in which we normally do them. And sometimes that feeling of not having a structure can be disorienting. So, in the first instance, we can say that the emergence of the ritualization of behaviors was in itself very practical. Even today, virtually all aspects of our culture and behaviors are infused with this kind of thinking. We learn behaviors like the fact that we should walk on the sidewalk and not on the road without even thinking about it. Seen from the outside, it might almost seem as if there is an invisible barrier between the edge of the sidewalk and the road that divides people on one side and cars on the other, a barrier that can only be crossed in certain points. Our lives are governed by imaginary patterns, in a sense invisible patterns, even though we make them visible. Humans much later than those who left the remains of Boxgrove, living around 100,000 years ago, seem to have also engaged in making the invisible patterns of their world visible. For example, by making beads that could be worn by an individual to show they belonged to a certain clan or held a certain status within the group. And we make the invisible barrier between the sidewalk and the road visible by the convention of building the sidewalk slightly raised, creating a small ledge that stands as a shorthand for the limit between sidewalk and road. We don't think of it in this way, but the curb is functioning as a symbol. Similarly, we paint crossings on the road, and these, again, stand as a visual marker for something invisible. When we walk across them, cars that could kill us seem to almost magically stop. It's as if these white marks on the asphalt generate a force field that stops cars. And in a sense, they do. It's a force field of culture, of shared imagination. And people every day walk across these sigils with almost the same confidence as if they actually emanated a physical barrier, even though the whole thing is just held together by imagination. Now, obviously, if, like I did, you grew up in a country where these rules are completely ignored, then you will probably have a slightly different experience, but you get the point. Now, this idea that there is a tradition, a way in which we do things, plays a very important role in hunter-gatherer societies, although in more complex ways than what you might expect. They're not just traditionalists. In fact, in some ways, they're more dynamic societies than we are, being unburdened by heavy infrastructures. And we have evidence of hunter-gatherer societies either developing or adopting new practices surprisingly rapidly into their lifeways in a very organic fashion. On the other hand, they have a reverence for tradition that our culture does not, and in a sense cannot have. Because for the hunter-gatherers, it would have been much more apparent than it is to us that the transmission of their culture, of their traditions, was the very life of their people. That story that tells the journey of a hero or a creator being is not just a story. It contains in it descriptions of the land, of the animals, of weather patterns, and for hunter-gatherers, knowledge of the land is everything. And that song that might be sung while picking berries doesn't just provide a beautiful aesthetic enhancement to the activity. It can also tell you where to find berries, which berries to eat or not to eat. A fishing dance is not just a fun performance based on the movements they make while fishing. It preserves within it knowledge about how to fish and provides a means for passing that information on. Although, to think of these merely in such utilitarian terms would be to miss the point. It is unfortunately common to see conversations around the artifacts or practices of indigenous and pre-settled peoples, essentially debating whether something is art or religious practice, whether it is practical or ritual, which is presupposing that there is a clear distinction between these, when the reality is often that the passing on of practice from one generation to the next is the very fabric that holds the culture together. Many activities repeat archetypes. As Courtney Raya says, each hunt is a reiteration of the first hunt. The musicking, the telling of stories, the ritualization, the repetition of gestures is the rippling and reverberating of patterns of behavior through the community and over time. This is how a small band of nomadic humans moving through a vast landscape transmits its lifeways and ensures its survival. We saw something similar in Chantelle Marlor's paper on the hunting techniques of the Plains Indians, where she described how they would become wolves, both at home in their camps and also on the prairie during the hunt. We shouldn't be thinking so much of a hunting ritual that propitiated the hunting activities. The hunt itself was, in a sense, a ritual, and it was not disconnected from the ritualized activities that went on at base camp during the preparation. And while on the one hand the entire activity can be understood as ritual, we can also see it displaying the same kind of thinking that we consider to be scientific thinking. Their imitation of the behavior of wolves was based on their observation of the success that wolves had hunting bison. And by incorporating those behaviors into their bison hunting, the Plains Indians were also very successful hunters. Similarly, the Blackfoot's use of singing that imitated the calls of a bleating calf to attract the bison to the best location for the hunt was also based on observations that the calls of a distressed calf attracted other members of the herd. Naturally, this singing had a profoundly spiritual dimension too. If you think of what we said about the restitutional behaviours going on in the stalactite formations in the caves of Rukador, we see a different form of restitution behaviour here with the Blackfoot. The taking of a power from the world, taking it for or into yourself, and then returning it to the world in the hopes of achieving a similar effect yourself. Central to these ritualized hunting activities was musicking. In the case of the singing of the bleating calf, it's very obvious how musicking fits into that. But what about in becoming the wolf? As described in Chantelle Marlor's paper, the Blackfoot performed wolves. In other words, they engaged in performances in which they became wolf brothers, symbolically, but in a sense also literally. Because when they enacted these performances on the prairie, they might as well have been wolves. Dressed in wolf hides, moving and smelling like wolves. They had the exact same effect on the bison. And the wolf performances back at base camp are the kind of thing that we could easily mistake as a purely ceremonial activity involving a dance of some sort or some other similar musicking activity. For the Blackfoot, they were becoming brothers with the wolves, sharing in the spirit of the wolf, bringing the power of the wolf into themselves. And in a sense, they literally were doing that. Because by engaging in performances where they imitated the observed behaviours of wolves, they were non-verbally acquiring the knowledge that wolves had about bison hunting. And they could then harness that power, the power of the wolf themselves. If this is making you think of the magician hunters we have talked about, that would not be completely out of place. And curiously, across cultures, musicking plays a central role in a whole host of practices that pertain to the acquiring or the granting of powers that are not native to a person or object. So the giving of powers and the receiving of powers into yourself. This kind of practice is something that we see in many world cultures, especially among pre-settled cultures and in early antiquity. For example, the granting of the power of an animal or god, and the distinction between these two is not always clear, to a warrior or a hunter. And how is it that the hunter is granted the power of an animal? If that person cannot acquire that power themselves, this is often where the figure of the shaman comes into play, as a mediator. The shaman is the one who is able to journey into the other world and commune with the spirits of gods, ancestors, or animals. The shaman can reach through and draw from the world beyond the power of the first hunters, or the wolf god, and grant it to the hunter. Singing and drumming are usually involved in the shaman entering a trance in which they are able to step over to the other side. But the musical connection does not end here. The force must then be granted to the hunter or the warrior. Now, across cultures, there are an infinitely diverse number of ways in which this is done, because these cultures are incredibly rich and complex in the detail of how they carry out their customs. But one of the most common ways of granting a power or giving an aspect to a person or object that isn't naturally part of them is to sing it into them, into the thing that is to be enchanted. Even the word enchant, to enchant, etymologically literally means to sing into. In Italian we have a similar word, incanto, which means exactly the same thing, both in terms of its modern meaning and its older etymological origin. In fact, a lot of our words to do with magic have etymological roots in musical meanings, or better, we might say that once these meanings were more interwoven and have since diverged. As you can imagine, we will be diving very deep into that in future episodes. So to start to wrap things up, what do we think was going on in these caves when we come across all these amazing finds? In terms of the specific detail of the practices, we have almost no idea of what these humans were up to. On the other hand, viewed in their totality, the finds that we have in this period from about 50,000 to 10,000 years ago give us glimpses into the unfolding story of human cultural modernity. We see over the course of this time frame that the depictions we find in rock art become increasingly monumental and large-scale. In fact, scholars like Gary Tomlinson propose that there is a continuity between these burgeoning activities in caves and the later emergence of monumental building at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey or Stonehenge in England, as well as with the monumental and ritual practices of early settled civilizations. We see the emergence and proliferation of representational figures, painted, sculpted, and carved. We see an explosion in symbolism, storytelling, musicking, and of behaviours that we would describe as ritualistic. We see an ever-increasing interest in invisible realms and Even though we can't know the details of what was going on, we can infer that there would have been complex interactions and overlap between all of these mediums. These activities would likely not have been like our idea of a performance, with a clear distinction between performer and audience. They would likely have been participatory. The storytelling, the rituals, and the magical practices would all have been deeply intertwined with the musicking, and the painting likely would have been too. We look at paintings as the finished result, but from other practices we observe around the world, it may very well have been that it was the act of painting itself where the significance lay, in the actual creation of the painting, more than the finished result that we see today. And if so, the painting too would likely have occurred in conjunction with musicking, ritual, and storytelling activities. We should also be thinking here of what we have said today and in other episodes about sound and musicking functioning as a conduit between this and other unseen worlds. And we will see in coming episodes how it is that musicking behaviours play such a central role in mediating the different aspects of these cultures. We also see in the bone flutes the organising of the invisible patterns of the world. The flute's design organises an invisible structure of frequencies and embodies it in a physical object. You can't see a musical scale, and yet we all picture them in our minds to a certain extent, in our imagination. And to be making these flutes, our Upper Paleolithic ancestors must have too. Now, when we talk about imagining invisible worlds or transcendent realities, we immediately think of the origins of things like religion and magic. And undoubtedly, behaviours of that kind were going on. In many instances, ancient humans probably were literally using their flutes and bull roarers to communicate with unseen beings and ancestors, or to manipulate invisible forces. But these cognitive modalities also underpin our art and social conventions, as well as abstract thought, mathematics, and scientific thinking. The only way in which we encounter pure mathematical concepts is through our imagination. To quote from SMBC, "Show me an actual two-dimensional plane." These are not things that we can touch or see. They are things that we can think about, and the only way that we can know them is in our thoughts. And the similarity with the modalities of thinking we have been describing here runs deeper. Take the number 1. No one's ever seen the number 1 itself, not the symbol for number 1 or one of something like one orange, but just the number 1 itself. Naturally, we've all had the experience of that feeling of a singularity of a given thing, what it feels like to experience the sense of an orange, an apple, a pencil, and so on, rather than 2 or 3 or 5 of those things. But we have never seen the number 1 itself, the oneness, if you will. This may seem trivial, but in fact, the number 1 itself, the idea of archetypal oneness, is cognitively the same kind of part for whole thinking as the idea of the first hunter, or of the archetypal wolf that the shaman draws power from. The number 1, the oneness itself, is the original that stands for all instances of 1. Numbers are archetypes. And there are those who explicitly believe in the actual existence of these mathematical archetypes. The mathematician Roger Penrose is a famous example, and his mathematics is absolutely next level, undoubtedly one of the greatest living mathematicians. So it would seem that for him, believing in the existence of a mathematical world that exists independent of human minds, and thinking of mathematical entities as real in this way, likely provides cognitive affordances that help him in thinking about the questions he tackles. In a nutshell, Penrose believes that pure mathematical forms, the perfect two-dimensional plane, or the perfect cube, or numbers, are real, and that they exist on some level, not simply that they are artifacts of the mind's attempts at describing the world. And since we don't encounter the pure mathematical forms themselves in the physical world, to imagine that they exist, he has to essentially posit a whole other plane of existence, a whole other world, if you will. A world of pure mathematics where pure mathematical forms actually exist. In fact, to be precise, Penrose actually posits the existence of three worlds: the physical, the mental, and the mathematical. But this is probably not the place to go into all of that. Now, the idea of this other world, this world of pure mathematics, is in many ways not that different from the idea of the other world where archetypes and gods exist. And in Penrose's view, we could say that the mathematician, like the shaman, is the specialist, the one who is able to reach into that world and pull knowledge from it into the physical realm. Scientific thinking is also all about uncovering the invisible patterns that underlie our reality. The very fact that we use words like underlie essentially seems to indicate that even though naturally there are all kinds of different ways in which scientists and philosophers think about these things, when we talk about them, both scientists and lay people alike very naturally slip into this way of talking that implies that these patterns we observe are essentially governed by realities that exist on a level that underlies the reality that we observe. Another level of existence, another world, if you will. This almost seems to be a sort of cognitive default for humans. And the way in which these quote-unquote underlying realities are conceived of is through imagination. Think back to your school days and those drawings of light waves you found in physics textbooks. They're drawn like undulating lines, but naturally that's not how they actually look. In fact, light waves don't look like anything other than that sensation of colour that emerges when they interact with your eye. To look like anything, a light wave would have to have yet other light waves bouncing off of it and reaching your eye. That's just how it works. And we might say, well, naturally, that diagram is in a sense just a visual representation of the equation for the wavelength of an electromagnetic wave. So, what about that equation? Is that what light really is? Well, obviously not. If you were to show those markings on paper to a hunter-gatherer and tell them that that's what light actually is, they would understandably think that you were a bit soft in the head. You might as well be pointing to the word flower and telling them that that's what a flower really is. So what is it that makes that equation similar to the drawing of the sine wave, and in turn makes both of these representations similar to the phenomenon of electromagnetic radiation? Simply put, it's our imagination, the connections we make in our mind. These models are, in a sense, ways of making the invisible world visible. Similar thing with gravity. If you were to talk to a physicist, they would likely tell you that gravity is truly one of the greatest mysteries. We have no idea what it is, and many would even say that thinking about it as if it is a thing, something that exists, is probably completely wrong. All we can observe is that matter attracts matter, and we can describe at which rate it happens. But beyond that, to imagine that there is an unseen, invisible force that is doing this is, cognitively, the equivalent of seeing a lightning bolt shooting down from the sky and imagining that it was cast down by a sky god. We see matter attracting matter, and it's as if when observing this, we cannot help but imagine that there must be some invisible thing that is doing this, some force that is causing this, even though we don't have a concrete reason to think this. And we call this force gravity. And in doing this, we have not really explained anything. What we have actually done is imagine an entire new entity into existence as a way of being able to think about something that, in essence, we would be unable to think about. Now, obviously, I'm simplifying significantly here, especially since this conversation does vary a bit depending on whether we're talking about Newtonian mechanics or 21st century physics, but the general point remains. And as we hinted at in the last episode, these ideas do in fact have their roots in magical thinking of various kinds. In Galileo's quasi-mystical Pythagoreanism, and in Newton's definitely mystical Christianity, and in his study of sympathetic magics. When you actually read their own writings, it is very clear that their ideas were not developed in spite of these worldviews, but precisely out of that very soil. Without that transcendent thinking, those ideas would not have acquired the form that they did. The historical reality is that the line between theoretical scientific thinking and mysticism is very faint, and it is crossed many times. And yet, despite all this, we classify physics textbooks as non-fiction. In a sense, the distinction between reality and fiction is itself a fiction, but a useful one, because these made-up models can often be very powerful tools for thinking about and interacting with the world around us. And this is maybe a better way of thinking about the ideas of other cultures, where we often wonder how could they believe such fantastical stories, when, in fact, we do the exact same thing. Ideas have a certain meaning within the context of their cultural niche. In other words, within the broader context of ideas that they inhabit. Going off of Gary Tomlinson's model of hyperindexicality, we can say that the ideas within a given cultural niche all point to each other in complex ways, and out of this arise their meanings and their ability to point to the world beyond their own system of references. And when you take ideas out of this complex set of indexical relationships and the relationships of sociality that surround them, they lose that meaning and that ability. The ideas and the stories of Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, the unseen beings and the forces that inhabited their world, were useful to them in their context. We know that they were because we have evidence of these humans not only surviving in a world that was much harsher than ours, but even flourishing, as documented by their artwork, their beadwork, their beautifully incised stonework, some of which is more beautiful and more intricate than later items we find in the early period following the agricultural revolution. These Upper Paleolithic humans are sometimes known as the affluent hunter-gatherers. If any of us were dropped into their world, we would not survive very long. Not just because we don't have the skills and the physical abilities to do so, but also because we don't have the necessary cognitive framework. Looking up at the night sky, they would likely have seen gods, animals, and ancestors. And the fact that they could do this, maybe exploiting many of the same neural pathways that we use for things like facial recognition, would have given them an immediacy, a speed in recognizing details of the night sky that we can only dream of, allowing them to see in the stars a map that they could use to navigate vast sprawling landscapes, and also a place where collective memories could be stored, because those stories of gods and ancestors were an integral part of the collective memory of the community. To paraphrase Maurice Bloch, culture can be understood as a place of shared imagination. And in a sense, this is what we are telling in these episodes, the unfolding history of human imagination, in which musicking played a central role and is inextricably interwoven. So hopefully this is really helping to bring into focus why this period from 50,000 years ago is seen in paleoanthropology as the period of human modernity. And obviously, this is just the time frame from which we have direct evidence of these behaviours. I personally agree with those who feel that there is evidence out there waiting to be discovered that will push this horizon back to 70,000 years, maybe earlier. And obviously, it's not as if we don't see evidence of shared imagination earlier than this. The beadwork that we mentioned earlier is a perfect example. It's just that compared to the humans from, say, 1 million years ago that we were looking at the start of episode 4, whose cognitive and cultural affordances were radically different from ours, what we see in the archaeological record in the last 50,000 years or so, all the way up to right now in 2020, though the differences may seem big to us, they are in a sense just variations on a theme. And Tomlinson here once again brings in the cavalry with his most recent book, Culture and the Course of Human Evolution, in which he gives us a biocultural model for human cultural variation that connects by gradual increments all the way back to the animal kingdom. He starts from niche construction. This is, in other words, the way in which an animal species' behaviour will have an effect on the surrounding environment, and how those changes in the environment then feed back into the behaviours and into the selective pressures placed on the animal, reinforcing certain patterns while reducing others. Tomlinson sees our human cultural variation as a very extended form of niche construction, intensified by all the things that we've been talking about in these episodes: symbolism, technological acceleration, and shared imagination, and in which the environment is understood not only as the physical world around us, but also as that very space of shared imagination that we inhabit. And that's where we will leave our story for today, I think. As always, you'll find a link in the description to download the audio version of this episode if you want to, as well as links and references to everything that we've been talking about in these episodes and examples of musics to listen to as well. So yeah, lots of cool stuff to check out in the description. And that's everything for today. So take care, and I will see you next time.